you're also something of a Renaissance man. So you end up teaching Russian history in Welsh.
In a sense, it was good fortune, but also in a way, you make your own luck. I call it the thrill of fluency. It's really about getting your hands dirty at this stage.
So today, I'm very happy to welcome Gareth Popkins, Dr. Popkins, longtime friend and language compadre, to the StoryLearning podcast. Gareth, it's great to see you, man.
Hello, Ollie. Thanks for inviting me, and good to see you too.
So for those people who, for whatever reason, do not know about Gareth, how would you describe Gareth? Who is Gareth? What does he do? What has led him to be here on this podcast today?
Oh, well, Gareth is, I suppose, first and foremost in this context, an enthusiastic language learner, teacher, course creator from England. I grew up in the north of England, in York, in a completely monoglot environment, not really much success with languages at school. But then I got the language book, I think, really in my early 20s, and got into taking French further, taking Welsh, which is sort of my heritage language on my father's side, learning that, and then spending time in Germany and Russia, working on German and Russian. So I've had a rather checkered trajectory. I started as a historian, working in a German university and focusing on Russian history. And then I went to law school in my early 30s and became an international finance lawyer, all the time continuing with my languages and starting to blog and vlog about language learning and sharing my experiences. And that is what I've continued to do. And I now do that full time and focusing in particular on teaching intermediate German learners.
We met, I guess, originally in some of the language events that were run in various places across Europe. I'm not sure when our first point of contact would have been. I'm guessing around 2014, 2015, something like that.
Were you at the first polyglot gathering or the second?
I don't know if I was at the first one, but I think I was at the second. I mean, I went to two in Berlin in the early days, which I think were 2014, 2015. And I don't think I've been back since. I imagine that's where I met you first, because that's where I met a lot of people.
Yes.
Yeah,
definitely. Yes.
And so we kind of come from a similar place, I suppose, in terms of just our lives have been characterized by just a love for languages and learning lots of languages. And we've kind of since migrated through to taking that passion, that experience and helping other people learn. What got you into languages?
That's a very interesting question. I think I was lucky when I was a kid that I went abroad on holiday with my parents. So we went to France many times, to Scandinavia. And I was just fascinated to hear other languages, which of course was completely exotic for me, because as I say, it was a completely monoglot environment where I grew up in rural Yorkshire. And also I knew about my family's heritage on my dad's side. So the name my parents gave me, Gareth, is a Welsh name. I knew that my grandfather, who passed away before I was born, so I never knew him, was a first language Welsh speaker. And we'd gone down to South Wales several times and heard sort of distant cousins speaking Welsh, and we went to visit them among themselves, which fascinated me. So totally intriguing, but also somewhat miraculous process for me, that you can actually communicate by making other sounds. Still seems to me a magical thing. And it's that excitement which has always driven me on. Although when I was in my school days, it just seemed to me to be an impossibly huge task.
Yeah, it is. It never loses its charm, does it? And if anything, certainly for me, I feel like the older I get and the more disenchanted I get with the state of the world, the more I tend to appreciate the beauty of learning languages and learning to be able to communicate with other people.
Yeah, I mean, I call it the thrill of fluency, and you get that at each stage, really, from ordering your first beer through to being interviewed for a job or interviewed on television in foreign languages, both of which I've done 7 times. But each stage also, of course, has its frustrations. And learning to cope with those and to accept that they're normal and to have just calibrate one's expectations realistically, I think is part of the key to being in the language game for the long haul, which is what I'm all about as well, really.
I often get asked, when I talk about my background with music, people often like to look for connections and patterns and draw lines and connections between different aspects of life and different things that we get up to. And I don't, I'm never really sure if there is a meaningful connection between language and music. It just kind of just so happened that I liked music and I like languages. You have a kind of similar, well, I guess similar but different journey in the sense that you have learned languages. I mean, you speak German, you speak Russian, you speak Welsh, a bunch more besides, I think. But you're also something of a Renaissance man. I mean, you've been a university lecturer in Russian history that you deliver in Welsh. You have been a doctoral student in St. Petersburg in the early 90s after the USSR collapse. You've been a finance lawyer. If someone were looking for patterns between and links between languages and your career choices, is there one there to be found? Or is this just you marrying up everything that you like in life and making it work somehow?
I think languages are certainly one of the threads. I like to think of, because I'm not the sort of person who takes things up and then drops them. Some people work serially at passions in life. I like to weave them all together. And excitement about languages and living in new cultures is one of the threads that runs through my life. So, yeah, I used my Welsh, then I lived in Wales, and then I worked in Wales, as you mentioned, using Welsh at the university. And then I chose a topic for my doctoral work in Russian history rather than in British history, because one of the reasons was I wanted to learn Russian. And my supervisor told me, well, you can learn German as well. It's an important language for the scholarship on 19th century Russia. And I knew that by taking that doctoral route, I would be able to, as I did, go on an Erasmus exchange program down to Freiburg in southwest Germany, get to spend a year in the Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg, working in the archives, so learning German, learning and using Russian. Then I got a year after that in Finland, researching in Helsinki, where there's a great Slavonic library, before returning to Germany and then winding up with this job teaching in Wales. That was sort of good luck, but there was a logic to it as well. And then when I decided to move on into law, I deliberately, as I was coming out of law school, joined a firm which had an international network, including an office in Moscow, because not only was the legal work going on there at the time, this was the early 2000s, really interesting, as Russia had opened up, but also, of course, it meant I could take my Russian further. So that has always been a thread, I think. My choices have been, always part of the picture has been, how is this going to help? How's this going to bring me some reward linguistically as well?
So you roll off that list of achievements and life events as if it were just something that happened. But let me just dive into this in a bit more detail, because I'm very curious how it happened. So you end up teaching Russian history in Welsh. So what happens first? Is step one you were learning Welsh and then moved to Wales? Is that what happened first?
There wasn't a master plan that it was going to end up like that. In a sense, it was good fortune, but also in a way you make your own luck. So after I graduated with my first degree, I decided I wanted to get back to my roots, learn Welsh, really go properly at one language. And so I went to Wales for a year and I got fluent in Welsh. I lived with a Welsh-speaking family. And then I was also started learning Russian during that year, just because one was never going to be enough. And then I went back to university to start my doctoral work. And I chose a topic which gave me good reason to go and live in Russia. Also, I had a supervisor who encouraged me to do German as well, because that's an important language in Russian studies.
But just on the Wales bit. So just so I get it right. So you decide to learn Welsh. So you go move to Wales and immerse yourself in Welsh, learn Welsh there, and you then take a job in Wales lecturing in Russian history. No. Then what happened was I ended up doing the doctorate in Russian history. This comes back to Wales, bear with me, and got to live in Germany, in Russia, and in Finland, and work on those languages. And then just as I was finishing my doctoral work, still matriculated in the UK at university, I then just fortunately was able to find this role in Wales lecturing. So that takes you back to Wales.
Yes. Yeah. So that was the chance to combine two of my passions, which was Russian history and Welsh in one.
What a dream job.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Who wouldn't take that?
Yes.
Absolutely. So then, I mean, so you say you learned Welsh in a year. Practically speaking, how do you think about that journey from starting to learn Welsh to becoming fluent enough in Welsh to then lecture in a university. Characterize that for us.
Yes. It was easier at that stage because one had more time, but I do like the metaphor when you're learning a language of a rocket taking off into space, in the sense that if you have the energy and the time to really go very intensively at the beginning, you can get to a sort of working knowledge, which to me is, getting out of the Earth's atmosphere, as it were. And then you can float forward with boosters as and when over the years and over the decades. And that's what I was able to do with Welsh. So I did, first of all, a summer school in Wales, in Lampeter, in the middle of rural Wales. And that was an intensive taught course. But then I was also working myself, systematically building up my vocabulary. So I like to work, I had a book with, this is all pre-internet, of course, different vocabulary, subtopics, sort of the farm, describing people, jobs, the usual things. So I was working on those and doing a lot of things right, actually, through more by accident than design at that stage. And then I went for 9 months to, also a stroke of good fortune, lodge with a very interesting and kind and welcoming Welsh-speaking family in Aberystwyth in West Wales, which is where I ended up working. And it was during that year, really, or that 9 months then, that I really got to practice and use the language an awful lot in that family and outside as well. Of course, learning a minority language is in a way a bit different because it's a lot more, in Aberystwyth, about half the people speak Welsh, everybody speaks English. You've got to make the extra effort. You've got to make sure you're plugged into networks, which worked with the accommodation and various other things I was doing as well. And in reflection, maybe it's not so different when you're a native English speaker in many countries, such as Germany, for example, where I am at the moment, where here in Berlin, a lot of English is spoken. So you have to make sure you're in the right networks and be quite firm about using your language. So a lot of those lessons from that Welsh experience I carried forward with my other languages.
By the way, if you're enjoying this interview, then you will love the free guide that I have put together with all of the best language tips from today's guest. We put all of the insights from the interview into a handy one-page PDF that you can refer to whenever you want. To grab it for free, you can scan the QR code on the screen if you're watching on video, or else click the link in the description.
It's interesting. I was speaking with Dave Pinto recently for the podcast, and we were talking about, he had a kind of similar, and I think we were talking about the fact that I think many of us have a certain phase in our life where we have the opportunity to go very, very deep on a language. In his case, it was Spanish. For me, it was a few different languages in my 20s when I should have been doing something more productive, but instead was just kind of bumming around learning languages. And it seems like for you, it was a period of your life where you had the time and space and inclination to devote yourself to that. Have you, in your subsequent language learning, have you managed to bring that same level of energy and dedication, create that same amount of time and space and focus for the language to the extent that you could with Welsh? Have you managed to replicate that multiple times? Or I'm curious if you also have that reflection that it's really the only kind of thing that you can afford to do at one point in your life, and it's difficult to ever repeat that.
Everybody's circumstances are different, aren't they? But no, I was able to do that, like you, in my 20s, with French and with Russian and German as well. So,
so that was all in that 1 10-year period.
Yeah, that was in that period. Yeah, I'd had some French at school, and that was actually the first one I started to work on and develop my own methods and approaches. And that was when I was on the side, when I was still an undergraduate. But since then, once you're holding down a job or you've got family commitments, of course, it does become a lot more difficult to get that sort of rocket booster effects I was talking about, so far as that depends on intensity. And for me, it's become much more with subsequent languages that I've been learning since then about building in the gaps, really, slots and opportunities to use the language, to study the language, to get input. And that is, or in my experience, a slower process, but there are other things going on. And it's also quite an enjoyable, added dimension to professional life or family life or whatever. But I do think the intensive, boost, if one can build it in somehow, is certainly hugely beneficial. And if you don't have that, then it's going to go slower. But again, that's not necessarily, for many of us, it's not a race anyway.
Indeed. Yeah. I mean, I've always felt that to a large extent, you can boil language learning down to just one metric, which is focus. And the more that you can just focus on it, the more results you'll get. And the difficult thing, of course, is managing to create that focus. And that it's one thing to do it when you're 20 and you can afford to become obsessed over something. You have all the time in the world, and you're never going to get old and all of that. It's a very different thing to be doing that. I mean, I struggle to do that to anywhere near the same level of intensity now with running a business and family and all of those things. So maybe a better question would be, so your language learning recently, you've been learning Basque, you've been learning Japanese. How does your learning now compare to the past? You've already said that it's a slower process and you're happy with that. But you're also someone who, having been through this process of learning many languages to a high level, you know what works and you know what effective looks like. So what is it that you do in the time and space that you do have to learn Basque and Japanese and anything else that you might be learning to get the biggest bang for your buck?
Yeah, I like to build it into my week. So for me, it's all about routines and habits. So far as I'm able to, even 15 minutes, half an hour a day, say 5 days a week. So I like to have a pattern. Say I'm going to spend the next 3 months focused on at the moment, intermediate Basque. Then I'm trying to make sure I like a regular slot, sort of first thing in the morning. And then what I'm doing then is actually very interactive. So I like to work with a course, whether it's an online course or a traditional course book or a video course, because I feel that the structure helps us. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. I like things to be explained. I personally like to understand from a position of wanting to know how the system works under the bonnet, under the hood, so to say. So a lot of active, interactive study, but then also an awful lot of input. So that would be what I would do in my main study slot, would be actually actively engaging with the language in quite a traditional way, with the course materials or with an article I'm reading or something like that. But then also when I'm washing the dishes or jogging, I'm listening to the course audio or to podcasts, depending on my level, aimed at learners or native material. When I'm shaving, I've got the radio on in one of my advanced languages, normally, that sort of thing. And then I would also try and book in, if I'm working on my speaking, couple of half-hour sessions a week with a one-to-one teacher as well to get me speaking. So that's sort of how it works. And then reading, of course, reading a lot. So I've always got books by my bed. And even if I'm not able to sit in the armchair and spend an hour reading, I might read a side or two if I wake up in the night or first thing in the morning or last thing at night. So that's how it sort of looks. But as you yourself will know, life often does get in the way. And then I find it does help just to have a few bedrock activities that you keep going, keep doing to keep things simmering. So for me, that will be listening to Japanese podcasts, of which there are a great many good ones for lower intermediate learners when I'm jogging, for example, or something like that. So that I feel a connection continuously with the language, even if I'm in a phase where I'm not focused on it.
If I was a fly on the wall and I just followed you around for a week, how much of the time would I see you doing English-based activities versus being in another language in some description?
Interesting. In my normal London life, when I was working in the law firm until very recently, you would see me on the commute, on the days which I was going into the office, either reading or certainly walking to the tube. I would have the headphones in, the earbuds in, I'd be listening to radio or podcast on the journey in and on the journey out. All the domestic activities at home and also recreational in the evening. So often if I want to watch half an hour before bed, something for entertainment on television, I would watch usually things in German or Russian. Did the lunch break, perhaps watch some YouTube with my coffee in one of my languages. So,
and are you fairly strict about this? I mean, are you the kind of person that, are you easily swayed by your mood, or do you tend to be quite rigorous in that at that time?
No. I think I've got quite a good balance, what I regard as a healthy balance. So I don't say no English, but I'm just so keen to consume material in my new languages because I just love the sound of them, that my English reading and my catching up on English films and so on does sometimes suffer. I got a lot of series I've just missed in English because there's stuff to watch in other languages. So when you're doing multiple languages like we do, as you know, it's also a trade-off, like the whole of life.
Yeah, no, but you've always struck me as someone who has a very sort of legitimate dedication and authentic passion for the language. It probably just sounds obvious to you, but there are so many people who treat language learning as an obligation of sorts. And if you ask them deep down, why are you learning it? They struggle to produce an answer, a very convincing answer. But when you do have this just genuine, almost childlike fascination with the language that just persists, everything kind of gets quite easy, doesn't it? And the activities make themselves in a way.
Yes. And that's why I think if someone's in a situation where, say, they have to learn a language because they need to get naturalization, or they need it for their job, but they're not really that interested, or they've gone to live abroad as a spouse or partner, for example, of somebody who's been transferred abroad, I think there's nothing worse than doing something you don't basically want to do. So you have to find ways to combine it as soon as possible with your existing interests. If you can start even following people on social media, if you're into a certain sport or you're into basket weaving or whatever it is, even if you're not understanding much, to try and make it relevant to you. Or if you're doing childcare, then you're learning the vocabulary around that. If you're talking to other parents at the kindergarten gate or whatever. So you've got to take a decision, I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
If you're constantly resisting, then it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
Decide what you're aiming for as well, because not everybody wants to get as near-native as possible. And then sort of focus in on that, but try and somehow make it relevant and interesting to you.
Yeah. Basket weaving. It's one of my personal favorites. Personal favorite. Yeah.
I thought it might be.
Especially before bed. I mean, nothing will send you to sleep faster than the Japanese basket weaving videos. So you focus now on the Dr. Popkins German YouTube channel. And the teaching operation that you have behind that. So you focus on intermediate learners. Talk to us about that. What's behind the decision to focus on intermediate learners, and what are the typical struggles that characterize someone at that level?
Well, I think when you're at that level, it's a real watershed, because a lot of people never get beyond the dabblers, beyond the beginners. And the challenges start to change. So you feel you've learned, at least theoretically, quite a lot already in basic situations, but you're still struggling to cope with language coming at you at native speed, at native conversation. There's still quite a lot of structures to come as well. You haven't covered everything. You don't have the vocabulary. So part of it is about helping you build structures and motivation which will carry you across this sort of so-called intermediate plateau, I think. And but also giving you the confidence to start to use what you've already actually learned at some level, but you haven't yet activated. So there's a lot of work around mindset, I think, which is really important at this stage as well, which is about accepting that it's going to be a longer haul than you thought when you first started. Again, as we've just been saying, thinking about why you're in it, why you want to do it, and then building the patterns on a weekly and daily basis, the habit, is also really important. And accepting, getting comfortable with ambiguity in understanding enough just to get the gist and communicate, and with making mistakes and pushing yourself into doing that in your own speaking and writing. So in the active skills, it's really about getting your hands dirty at this stage. And that's what I aim to give my students, a framework within which they can get further stuck in.
You say framework. I was thinking as you were talking, I mean, is framework and structure, I don't know if it's too much of a leading question, but is framework and structure a big part of it at that stage? Because my experience of this intermediate plateau has always been that you just kind of lose focus and direction a little bit, because it just feels like nothing you're doing is working. And so it takes some discipline and wisdom, actually, to be able to say, look, I'm doing all this work. It feels like nothing's working. I'm not improving. and yet I'm going to keep studying in this way every day and take it on faith that it's going to result in results eventually.
Yeah, I mean, people differ, don't they? Some people are much more spontaneous. They have lower boredom thresholds, perhaps. Other people are by nature much more methodical. So you have to look at your own personality as well. But somehow you do need, I think, to build in opportunities daily to use the language. And as I say, with my students, we have materials which I release to them in a sort of drip basis, so they don't feel overwhelmed, because that's another thing. You can end up feeling overwhelmed. And then there's a routine. So I work very much with a weekly routine, but I encourage people to try and set aside, as I say, the sort of half an hour a day. And I do find it's better if it's always the same time. So it could be during your lunch break, it could be before the family gets up or whatever. But also if you are, say you've got a family, if they know that this is your half an hour where you please don't interrupt unless it's a complete emergency, that I think sort of helps as well. But yeah, you do, I think, need to, just as you say, keep going on, in a sense, on faith. But if your mindset again switches to not focusing maybe on the outcome so much, of course we will want outcomes, but it actually enjoying the process, including getting comfortable, as I say, with the ambiguity and the mistakes, then it becomes easier, I think, just to keep going.
Process, not product. Absolutely.
Sort of, yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, listening to you talk, but also knowing you, I mean, it's so clear that you've been on this journey yourself, and this is what I always really enjoy speaking with others who, like me, are not the native. We're not teaching our native languages here. We're teaching something. We're teaching the journey that we've already been on, and it's easy for. I have some friends who are teachers, non-native teachers like us, who feel very self-conscious about their ability to teach the language because they're not a native speaker. But I personally think it's a huge advantage because we know what it's like to have been through this process. You've been through that process at that, struggling with that intermediate stage and getting through it, and not just in the German that you teach now, but in multiple languages. And that's incredibly valuable for someone. I'd go so far as to say that it's something that a native speaker teacher might not even be able to help with, because sure, they can teach the language element of it, but are they familiar with the psychology and the mindset and the behavioral nature of it, which is actually what makes the difference? Or you certainly can't succeed without that, can you?
No, absolutely not. And of course, native teachers can offer their own advantages, a really inside view. I personally find that most helpful in my advanced languages, where it's really about the fine nuance. And I already know I can do it. I've sort of got to the sunlit uplands where there's still a lot more undergrowth, even more undergrowth perhaps than you realize. So as you said earlier, it never sort of ends. But I try to guide people and say, look, I'm an advanced learner of German myself. I still make mistakes.
Always learning.
I'm still learning all the time. But hey, that's part of life. If it's the cracks are where the light shines in, as it were, that's where your humanity comes through. People can relate to you then as a language teacher and a language motivator.
How boring would it be if we were all perfect, huh?
As you say, from first-hand knowledge. Yeah, from first-hand knowledge. And that also, in a way, I find students feel then almost less intimidated, because you become more relatable. And I'm not somebody who I think we all have different talents, but some people are far better than me. I know that from attending these language learner events, that, for example, mimicking accents, producing a good accent, which I still find difficult, something which is difficult to do. I've always felt, perhaps everybody does, that my memory is not so good. But I really encourage people as well to focus in on what their actual strengths are. So I like reading. I'm very interested in current affairs and ideas, so I try and bring that into my language learning. Other people will be the sort of people who can walk into a bar or a shop and get into conversation very easily. Or they have a burning passion for, I always think of sports. I'm completely non-sporty, or music for that matter. I'm also non-musical. And you find ways to harness your strengths and your talents And that's where these other interests and other fields, I think, come in more to sort of power your own intermediate language learning.
So if I were to ask you who's going to win the Premier League this season, you would say?
Well, I wouldn't quite say what's the Premier League, but I would have to say, well, no idea.
No, yeah, we're on the same wavelength there. So Gareth, those German learners who are looking to reach the sunlit uplands, where can they find Dr. Popkins on the interwebs?
Well, the best place to find me is my YouTube channel at Dr. Popkins German. And I also have a general language learning website, which has been going for a long time, where I discuss my own projects and my general ideas about language learning. And that's howtogetfluent.com, where you can also get in touch with me. So those are the two places. Also on Insta at Dr. Popkins German.
We will put links to all of those things in the description. And Gareth, great to chat as always. And good luck with all of your various projects.
Thanks a lot, Ollie. Great talking to you.
And don't forget to download your free guide with all of the language tips from today's guest. You can scan the QR code on the screen if you're watching on video, or else click the link in the description.